Hello and welcome. I am Zerbraxi. World of Warcraft Classic has taught us all a lot, and I think it's time that we reflect on maybe the lessons that we've learned from Classic before we enter through that dark portal into the Burning Crusade. Now, understand too, some of these things that I may put in this video are lessons. Some of those may be to me, or maybe you disagree with what I think is a lesson we've learned, and vice versa. Some of this may be that the community thinks this is a lesson we've learned, but you might not. So understand that this video is meant to be a bit of a broad applicability to this. Don't take it personally. With that out of the way, let's go. It's really interesting to think back on the launch of Classic WoW. Everyone had their own expectations of what the game would be. Those who played vanilla 15 years prior had their expectations. The private server community was confident in what Classic would look like. Oh, and let's not forget all of those who actually never touched vanilla, but heard the epic stories and those tales, and they had their own expectations as well of what was to come. And in the end, each group was kind of wrong in their own ways. However, there does appear to be some consensus by a large portion of the player base that some elements of Classic should have been handled differently. Among those, let's start with progressive itemization. This was a discussion that was very loud during Classic's announcement, that the game absolutely needed progressive itemization to stay even remotely authentic. Depending on what patch in the game we were, it would change an item from being possibly useless to incredibly valuable. Then you come to when certain pieces were brought into the game, and that created a whole nother conversation. Many quests were also added in later patches, and with them would come more powerful rewards. Some loot tables for dungeons even were changed in vanilla as the game went on. Of course, Molten Core had this treatment as well, with entirely new sets of gear dropping from when a later patch would roll around. So what did Blizzard do? Well, they did this kind of compromise. Items would be released during the phase that closest matched the patch that they were originally dropped with. This isn't entirely true though, as some quests that shouldn't even have been introduced until later were in Classic at launch, but progressive itemization was mostly scrapped, and Blizzard released all of these items in their final iteration. While many people argued that re-experiencing the ever-changing item progression of vanilla would have been clunky and frustrating, there's no doubt that it also would have truly sold what vanilla was really like. With the Burning Crusade Classic originally announced, they were continuing with this no progressive itemization model, but they've seemingly backed down on this slightly, with badges not dropping from certain raid bosses at launch, and also the nethers not being available from the badge vendors immediately. These changes are definitely a step in the right direction, and they do provide a more authentic experience, while also just in general being beneficial to pacing of progression as well. One major itemization change that has yet to be announced though is the original Kaichan gear. When Kaichan originally launched, the gear was lackluster and was basically barely on par with Heroic Blues. While some pieces from Medivh's Tower would be big upgrades, many players at launch quickly found themselves running Kaichan strictly for other players and not themselves. While having Kara this way at launch of the Burning Crusade Classic might kill Kaichan's participation early, a well-timed itemization shift to emulate how TBC was originally could be a cool experience to have once again. Also, since players know what the gear will end up being in the end, the people may still want to compete in Kaichan in order to get a piece that they know will be adjusted to be awesome soon. One of the original main points about progressive itemization is that without it, there was this risk that you would jeopardize the original raid's difficulty. Well, I guess my question then becomes, how important is the raid difficulty and that authenticity really? Apparently very important. There are many players out there who swear that Classic to this day was a failure because the raids were as trivial as they ended up being. Blizzard's inability to capture that same level of difficulty we bumped in 2005 just didn't cause a brief distaste towards Classic, but the argument about raid difficulty persists to this very day. What's really interesting about this point is that in the original debate, it wasn't just presented by a bunch of elitist 1%ers, but actually by the community at large. There are a couple key specifics that I think we can take away from Classic's raid difficulty discussion though. First, too easy is a problem. While almost no one is arguing that Classic's raids should be overtuned to match some difficulty that you'd find from like Mythic Sire to Nathrius, there is a balance to be struck in order to present an interesting challenge. This is a video game after all, and games are intrinsically tied to challenge and failure and obstacles. The difficulty of that challenge can vary wildly from some examples like say Shantae or Sekiro, but the reality is that the overwhelming majority of players enjoy overcoming an obstacle, and raiding provides a social and mechanical avenue to pursue that goal. The second point is that no matter what Blizzard does, if they intend to keep encounters accurate and representative of their originals, then the content is going to be easier. The core of raid bosses is like solving a Zelda boss. Notice the term solving. By their very nature, Zelda bosses are rarely mechanical feats of strength, but instead are mostly a puzzle to solve, with the remainder being that execution. WoW's raid bosses are kind of the same. The original challenge of an encounter almost always stems from learning and understanding the mechanics. Putting that into practice takes time, but when you know everything up front, then the challenge becomes decreased severely. This is an obstacle Blizzard cannot avoid without making entirely new boss fights. So, what's the solution? Well, actually, Blizzard is kind of going the right path with this one. Burning Crusade Classic's approach of allowing players to engage in pre-nerf raids and dungeons is probably the perfect way to blend an accurate representation of TBC while adapting to the ever-growing nature of players from 15 years in the future. This would also give Blizzard the option to turn down the dial if maybe some pre-nerf encounters are actually too difficult. Raiding is my all-time favorite activity in WoW, and Blizzard understanding that challenge is necessary to keep players engaged is a welcomed response, and something that Classic WoW has really taught all of us. It's kind of impossible to talk about raid tuning without mentioning world buffs and professions. In the age of Classic WoW, world buffs are probably one of the coolest elements to the game that seemingly everyone was excited for, and yet now no one wants. We could argue all day about whether or not world buffs and engineering, for example, are social problems or mechanical issues in WoW, but we did learn a lot from Classic about these things in the end. It's not a problem that something is best, but it very much could be a problem if the variance between the best and the average is too large. Engineering's tools are quite exceptional with this, and TBC, while doing things a bit closer to the character's personal growth by, say, tying power to like tailoring, leatherworking, and blacksmithing, we're still not too out of the fire yet. The drums battle isn't over yet, and while many people seem to be caught up on the extreme sides of the argument about whether you actually need drums or to just not use them if you don't like them, the reality is that the issue stems from that variance that I mentioned earlier. Most people don't seem to care that drums make leatherworking the best pick for raiding. People seem concerned by just how much drums add to the player. Well, don't take this as a definitive answer, since I can't say I'm extremely proficient with every class and spec, but something to consider for those of you who are concerned about drums here. An arcane mage with perfect gear and perfect mana management and play. We can simulate this with and without the effects of drums. When comparing these sims, the average DPS between these two states is less than 4% on average. Now, there are some of you who might say that 4% is huge, and that knowing you're operating 4% worse is just going to bother you immensely. However, having a Shadow Priest bring the Misery debuff is a larger DPS gain to you personally than 100% drum uptime. Something to consider. While you can never change the social pressure that's asked of other players, perhaps if everyone understood the real power difference between, say, enchanting, jewel crafting, and leatherworking, then some of that social pressure might die off. And that might be better for everyone involved. Yeah, right. Who am I kidding? We all remember 400 millisecond spell batching, right? It hasn't really been that long. Remember when everyone was pressuring Blizzard to make sure that it was implemented into Classic and how not having it would ruin the entire experience? Remember when it was just basically removed in the last patch and the response was a global cheer? Yeah, I guess it goes to show that some interactions that we have a fondness for might not be worth the full scope of what it takes to ensure that they stay. Two mages polymorphing each other is, well, it's funny. But having to be attentive to when you buy something from the vendor because the batch might screw up the amount you bought is annoying to a level that only people who've ever played Bad Rats can understand. Now, there's a game you probably haven't heard of. Expecting Blizzard to emulate technical limitations is something that the community as a whole has kind of accepted might not be best practice. This can be a bit more nuanced though, and should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Paladin seal twisting makes Retribution gameplay far more interesting and potent, so having that class and spec keep it Well, that seems fine. The fact that drink walking is removed is kind of a bummer, since it's a pretty fun interaction that allows some players to manipulate the game in a mechanical way that requires precision, so perhaps that should stay to some degree as well. Having a player die because they took damage 350 milliseconds after you've healed them? Yeah, that sucks, and I'm really glad it's gone. With the legendary event of Encourage behind us, I think we can all agree that it was, well, it was alright. While there isn't any other event like this to come in WoW in the future, I think the overall meh that most players seem to have with it stemmed from the complete predictability behind the event, quite literally being remembered for its surprise and chaos. Classic has taught us that maybe it's okay for Blizzard to shake things up a bit and do what it takes to keep the content fresh. This phrase has kind of gone around a lot lately, but the feeling of authenticity being more important than authenticity is an interesting mantra. While I can't say I stand behind that comment to every point, the opening of the gates of AQ was a highlight from my time in vanilla and one of my all-time favorite MMO memories ever, and when I got to experience that with some friends who had never seen it before, we all kind of left very underwhelmed. I made a whole review on the AQ event and what I think should have been done, so feel free to check that out if you want more of my thoughts on that topic. I could keep going, but I think I've hit the bulk of the points I wanted to make. Classic WoW has been an awesome experience, and while my time in it was far more limited than I had hoped due to that pesky pandemic making my work completely consume my life, I thoroughly loved being able to relive this time in WoW. It's something that I definitely will return to from time to time. With the Burning Crusade Classic on the horizon, Classic has taught us so much. Classic WoW is a very different beast from vanilla, and we've accepted that. The prevalence of boosting was never like this in vanilla, and it's changed the landscape of leveling, the open world, dungeon groups, and the economy. The market has been so incredibly solved that people are able to capitalize on materials in extremely aggressive ways that we've never seen before. Botting in Classic is without question the worst botting I've ever seen in my entire life, and I've played more games than is healthy for a single human being. We've all had to learn very quickly that Classic isn't going to be vanilla again. It's not the same experience that we once had, but it's a massive set of new experiences that the world has never seen before. While it's a bummer for some that they don't get to genuinely relive the original journey, I think it's also exhilarating that the future will hold new stories and new adventures that you didn't think possible. World of Warcraft Classic is very different from what we expected, and honestly, that's probably the largest lesson that it can teach the Burning Crusade. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you've made it this far and you actually did enjoy, then why not drop me a follow over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Zerbraxi, where chat basically runs my life, and it's chaotic and a lot of fun, so please feel free to stop by. Also, if you did like the video and you want to see more Classic WoW stuff, then of course hit that thumbs up and subscribe button, and hit the thumbs down if you thought it sucked and you really disagree, because I need to be humbled sometimes. Also, if you want to hear my opinions about all things, everything else, follow me on Twitter. And I think that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!